So thinking about all of these huge amount of uses for performance information, the question is always, how can we go about starting to gather this information and get it together in one spot? So in general, to be able to use performance measurement information on an ongoing, useful way, we want to make sure that we're receiving the information on an ongoing, useful way. Some data that's, comes up every 5 or 10 years, or, some of the StatsCan surveys are every 7 years. That's really useful, but it is really helpful to move toward getting more regular data. So types of data that we can get, that again, I'll pick on you, Dan talked about, are the surveys. So I think you said there was an annual survey and then every 2-year survey of the community. So things like that are really great to start working toward either, I don't know if you do it solo or in conjunction with partners or other organizations in the community. Another good thing to do around surveys is to see if there's other surveys going around conducted by other organizations. See if you can get a few questions in that survey to ask a few, whether it's how do you feel about XXX, try to figure out if you can get some questions and kind of piggyback on other people's surveys. There's also focus groups that are always a really great option, especially when you have kind of a good linkages in the community to find the potentially very specific clients that you would like to talk to. There's also pre-existing data. So there's things like the census available through usually the CANSIM tables. There's the government open data portal. I believe a lot of organizations are using the community data program, if that's familiar to people, to access data that is collected at a national or maybe a provincial or maybe even municipal level, depending on where you are, that you can kind of access and kind of manipulate in a way that can be useful for you and your outcomes. There's also data collected about clients for service purposes, which is what we would kind of call administrative data. So data that may be collected in order to serve somebody or just in order to, track people coming to a meeting or something like that, where you can kind of make that data useful in a performance way as well as tracking how many people are coming to each event. There's data collected by partners. This may depend on your maturity, the types of partners that you have, but it could be possible to leverage usually anonymized data from your partners depending on the type of data activities that they are doing as well. And then the administrative data on lots of sides, specifically financial data, your financial data, how much you get funded and how many things you hold or how many clients you serve or how many clients come to your meetings, and kind of turning that into a cost per event or something like that, or an average event cost. Things like that, and just changing the data a little bit, that helps to tell a little bit of a story about how your organization is doing things. Also here, you can see my caveat at the bottom around when you're looking at using other people's data, surveys, linking data, all of that stuff, it's really important to think about privacy. And I know that in the earlier session, there's a lot of concerns about, or not concerns, but a lot of questions about privacy. So it's really good to know that that's, top of mind. So just to keep that in mind as well. For us, we have typically in a logic model for us, we have kind of two sides. And one side is the administrative, the efficient management of things that you saw in the last two slides around funding and demonstrating efficient management. And then we have the more concrete things around how many events are we holding or what are the actual client outcomes. So your data sources may be quite different for that. And they may be depending on the type of information you're looking for and the length of time information. What we find for us is the longer term we're trying to look at our effect maybe 2 or 3 years after something. It kind of more and more depends on surveys and circling back around to those participants that were there to maybe follow up with them. So versus administrative data maybe used a little bit more upfront. For us, and again, Dan, you must have seen my presentation ahead of time. It's perfect. For us, for each program in IRCC, we have ours is called a performance measurement strategy framework. Performance measurement framework or performance tracker, it's all the same thing. It's a tool, usually a table, that describes all of the information that will be required to measure your performance around meeting your indicators and your outcomes. And basically what we typically see in one of these tables is what the data source or the data collection method is. So if it's a survey or a focus group or partner data, how often it's collected or reported, who is responsible for doing it, whether it's you or getting into having maybe some partner responsibility for collecting this data. And then targets, if that is meaningful or relevant. It isn't necessarily always required. And sometimes targets are the only thing that makes something relevant. If you have, 5 events, is that good? Is that bad? Is that more than you wanted? So in that case, when you're looking at those types of things, targets are a little bit more relevant and helpful in figuring things out. Also, if required, it's a little bit, getting into the weeds here, but potentially methodologies or limitations. So it's possible that something doesn't quite capture something, but it's kind of the best data source that you have. In that case, you can kind of just, there's usually like a notes or comment section to indicate if there's any concerns about the data or that, maybe something might not necessarily be going forward every year. So it's good to keep track of that so that if you're reviewing this at any point in time, you can kind of take a look and check that out. What this helps you do is when you have this structured approach and you're reviewing it on a fairly regular basis, what it lets you do is monitor the success of the program, make informed decisions, and like David was mentioning, do those course corrections ahead of time rather than waiting till the end of something and then trying to, fix it during the next contribution agreement. And to make sure that information is gathered as efficiently as possible. So the last little bit here is about key considerations to remember, besides the privacy I talked about in a couple slides ago, is that depending on your uses of the information ultimately, your cycles in terms of how often you want to collect this information might be quite different. So for course correcting, and if you're trying to kind of manage something that's just getting off of the ground, you might want to monitor it a little bit more closely, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly. After a certain point, there are probably things that are only really relevant to look at on an annual basis. And then furthermore, there are things after that that might even be relevant to only look at the end of a contribution agreement or at a 3 to 5 year cycle, depending on a funding agreement or whatever cycle you're looking at. So you can add that into the performance measurement tracker as well. Take a quick look at what type of time frame is useful for most of these things. The APRCP is a good example of this. It's an annual report, so if anything is in there, you can at least confirm that it's in there annually. So that's it for us. If there's any discussions, we'd like to hear your lessons and your challenges that you're facing, your best practices, and any issues that you're facing in terms of data gaps. That's it.